Just go ahead and put them up here.
A scene from a war of the future. Elite American medics with a role so critical they're under the direct command of the president. Their patients are casualties of biological warfare.
Maintain communication at all times when you prepare to lift and things of this nature.
Is everyone ready?
No.
Okay. Not yet. Come when you're ready. I'll break the seal when you're ready.
Just make sure that the band does not slide the black band.
Okay. Gotcha.
Good.
In this exercise, the victim has been struck by a weapon which was neither seen nor heard, a microorganism killing him from within.
Then you take over, okay?
It can also kill those who help him.
Run your hands along the band, Sergeant.
The victim must be isolated, even on the flight home for treatment.
Okay, seal broken. Ready to transfer patient.
The real nightmare is that germ weapons, which are becoming ever more readily available, could afflict many thousands of soldiers and civilians.
Okay, here comes the torso now, guys. Okay, you guys ready back there? Ready, sir?
No one can agree on how to stop these weapons spreading. It may already be too late to catch the genie of germ warfare.
Backside, medevac 22, over. Roger, backside, medevac 22, Charlie 130, inbound, your location, ETA.
Biological warfare, long feared but rarely addressed seriously, is emerging as one of the greatest threats of the next millennium.
We have one casualty to offload with an unknown infectious disease for transfer to Fort Detrick Isolation Suite. Roger, medevac 22. Is the ambulance standing by for that casualty transfer? Roger, Pikeside 22 out.
There is reason to believe that biological weapons could be the special weapon to be most concerned about in the future, and there are a couple of reasons for that. It's a lot cheaper to go ahead and produce biological weapons as compared to nuclear weapons. The infrastructure for producing biological weapons already exists in well over 100 countries. If you have a viable pharmaceutical capability, if you have a viable fermentation capability in either the making of beer or other kinds of food products, you have the technological infrastructure for a relatively crude biological weapon.
Biological weapons, by spreading disease and terror, are far easier to use in an attack than to defend against. Even the United States, with this special unit, is poorly prepared.
We probably have the best program available anywhere for dealing with this. It's just that the United States and every other country in the world is behind. Our ability to defend ourselves on biological weapons is lagging far behind the capability that somebody who wanted to use those weapons offensively. So I don't want to scare anybody, but it's the world of biological weapons is pretty scary.
The US Army's Biological Defense Center. Casualties of biological attack would be brought here in time of war. This one small unit with just 2 beds is the only one of its kind in the entire Western world, and the military is suddenly realizing that it simply isn't adequate. Biological weapons are spreading to more and more countries, perhaps 12 already, and it won't stop there. The revolution in biological engineering is making it easier all the time to manufacture deadly organisms. And unlike other powerful weapons, chemical or even nuclear, which can sometimes be detected by spy satellites, biological weapons can only be seen through the lens of a microscope. There are variations in these invisible killers, different forms of biological weapons. One type is made up of bacteria, some of them naturally occurring, like anthrax. Less than 1/10 of 1/1,000,000th of a gram can kill. 30 grams could wipe out the entire population of the United States. This is anthrax infection of the skin. If the infection reaches the lungs, the victim suffers choking, fever and death within 4 days. The cholera, which claimed so many lives in Rwanda, shows how quickly such diseases can spread. It wasn't passed on deliberately, but as with anthrax and plague, it can easily be, and has been in the past. Some bacteria can't be used as weapons in themselves, but produce toxins, a second type of biological weapon. This is Clostridium botulinum, the source of botulism poisoning. 100,000th of a gram can kill. At Fort Detrick, scientists use an electron microscope to identify a third class of biological weapons, viruses. 100 times smaller than a bacteria, viruses invade healthy human cells to cause a range of fatal diseases. Many have yet to be identified, and vaccination may be impossible. Most viruses kill through fever and severe internal bleeding. In wartime, they could be delivered by mosquito. There have been plans for this.
There are a number of difficulties involved in thinking about how does one defend against biological weapons. One critical point is that only small amounts of biological material can be very, very effective. For example, in the chemical weapons area, we think of hundreds of tons of material being militarily effective. In the biological weapons area, however, tens of kilograms of biological material can be very, very deadly. It just does not take that much of something like anthrax, for example, to inflict a great deal of damage.
In the chilling terms of military calculation, biological weapons can be the most potent of the so-called weapons of mass destruction. In an attack on a large city with an average density of population, a 300-kilogram chemical weapon could kill 3,000 people. A nuclear weapon weighing perhaps 200 kilograms might kill up to 40,000 people. But only 30 kilograms of anthrax, if sprayed over the city on a still day, could kill twice as many. At Britain's biological defence establishment at Porton Down, scientists fear that as chemical and nuclear weapons become harder to obtain, biological weapons will become even more attractive.
There are some 10 states that are believed to have or are seeking biological weapon capabilities, and I think there's a real possibility that given the signing of the Chemical Weapons Convention, the fact that the Non-Proliferation Treaty covered the nuclear acquisition, that biological weapons might be seen as a weapon of choice for states seeking to acquire weapons of mass destruction.
Another reason biological weapons are spreading is that they're so easy to obtain. Some of the agents, which may have legal uses, can even be bought through mail-order catalogues. From such a tiny starter culture, it's then relatively easy to breed almost any amount. First, the bacteria, for example anthrax, is added to a flask of a simple, widely available sugar solution in which it can grow. The mixture is warmed and stirred. Within 12 hours of fermentation, the anthrax will have multiplied to produce as many as 100 billion new bacteria, enough, in theory, to kill over 10 million people. Delivery is more difficult than production, yet requires little more than dispersing the bacteria as an aerosol spray, using, for example, an agricultural crop duster. To ensure sufficient coverage, larger quantities may be needed, but again, this presents no real problem. Industrial fermenters are widely available and ideal for producing many kilograms, and there's nothing the Western military can do about it.
We are less prepared to deal with the threat of the use of biological weapons on the battlefield than any other threat that is facing us. We have a great deal of work to do to enhance our ability to detect biological weapons on the battlefield, and we have a great deal of thinking to do on what our immunization policy will be to protect our soldiers.
arm.
All right.
Ready?
Vaccination is one of the few lines of defense against biological weapons. But vaccines only work against agents which are known about in advance. Until recently, this hasn't been a problem, because only a limited number of naturally occurring agents are suitable for use as weapons. But science has not stood still. Revolutionary advances now threaten to create whole new types of biological weaponry.
Universal Pictures presents a Steven Spielberg film, Jurassic Park.
Genetic engineering can now create almost anything. The film Jurassic Park took this to the extreme. In the story, the DNA or genetic fingerprint of dinosaur blood was extracted from a fossil and manipulated to recreate dinosaurs. Part of that process, the adjustment of genetic material, is fact, not fiction, and could be applied to biological weapons with deadly effect.
The things that genetic engineering or modification might make pretty sticky are, for example, vaccination. Vaccines work by recognizing particular features of particular disease-producing organisms. And if one's able to tailor the organism to not have these features, the vaccine won't recognize it. And the person, even though they've been immunized against the basic organism they've attacked with, it won't protect them against the modification.
Genetic engineering may not only render vaccines useless, it could also make treatment impossible. This is how Russian scientists recently engineered a form of plague that could not be treated by known antibiotics. It involves taking an antibiotic-resistant strain of a harmless agent like E. coli and breeding it. A centrifuge forces all the DNA into the bottom of a test tube. Excess liquid is poured off to leave a white paste of neat DNA. An enzyme is added, which effectively cuts out the segments of the DNA which cause the resistance to antibiotics. And finally, the DNA segments are added to plague. The disease, as it spreads, will then resist the drugs that normally cure it. Genetic engineering also offers the possibility of more exotic biological weapons.
The primary impact has been in making biological weapons agents that in the past were very difficult to acquire, making them far more accessible. For example, take toxins, which are particularly important in this respect. Rattlesnake toxin in the past, if you wanted to collect enough of it to use as a weapon, you'd have to have a barn full of rattlesnakes, and then you'd have to milk each one of them regularly to obtain the toxin, and this would take an enormous length of time to pile up enough of it to really use. Now we can take the rattlesnake toxin gene, we can clone it in E. coli or some other simple laboratory bacterium. We can grow it in big vats, we can grow it in fermenters such as are used for beer, and we can readily, in a very short time, produce any quantity we're interested in.
But genetic engineering can do more than manufacture snake venom and other poisons. It can plant that poison in other organisms. A highly infectious virus, like flu, for example, could be cloned with the gene which allows a snake to produce venom. It means that if you catch this flu, you would suffer the agonizing death of a snake bite. It's a prospect most scientists believe is possible. Some go further and predict that genetic engineering will allow particular racial groups to be targeted by biological weapons, ethnic cleansing by test tube. Some of these ideas will become more likely. Science is advancing so rapidly.
Biotechnology is widely available and spreading. For a couple reasons. The know-how to produce these weapons is not going to be the thing that keeps people from doing it. We've had the ability to do fermentation, yeast making, wine making for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and basically that's the technology one needs to produce biological weapon agents. More sophisticated biotechnologies are also spreading, and indeed one wants to encourage that. We want health problems to be solved around the world. We want to improve food production. We want to spread modern agricultural and medical technologies. But inherent to the spread of technologies for civil and legitimate use is a possibility that some might use the same technologies to produce weapons of mass destruction. And really, one can't have one without the other.
None of this would matter if germ weapons were never to be used, but history has shown otherwise. Even back in the Middle Ages, armies would catapult infected corpses into cities under siege to spread disease. It was the Japanese, though, in the Second World War, who used biological weapons on a large scale for the first time. In Japan's attack on China, plague and cholera were deliberately released to support the offensive. At the notorious Camp 731, Japanese researchers developed new germ weapons in gruesome experiments which claimed thousands of Allied lives. After the surrender, many of those responsible were tried for war crimes, but most were freed by the United States in exchange for the results of their research. Their information became the basis of America's own massive push for biological weapons after the war.
You are in Fort Detrick, where some 600 military and civilian scientists work together in research at the Army Biological Laboratories. The professional staff at Fort Detrick specialize in such sciences as medicine, pathology, bacteriology, virology.
It was soon obvious, though, that advances in offensive biological weapons were not being matched by advances in biological defense, which remained basic.
There's a new poison. 1 ounce can kill all the people in the United States.
Germ warfare can wipe out an entire city.
Submarines could release aerosols near coastal cities. Specially designed germ-carrying bombs could be dropped. Enemy agents could contaminate the city water supply. How can we protect ourselves from BW attacks? Keep yourself and your family clean. Don't help germs by making things easy for them. Germs have trouble living in clean places. Enroll in a Red Cross home nursing course. Then if sickness does come to your home, you'll know what to do.
Sensing its own vulnerability, the United States announced in 1969 that it was giving up its germ weapons. It hoped other countries might then do the same.
Biological warfare, which is commonly called germ warfare. This has massive, unpredictable, and potentially uncontrollable consequences. It may produce global epidemics and profoundly affect the health of future generations. Therefore, I have decided that the United States of America will renounce the use of any form of deadly biological weapons that either kill or incapacitate.
3 years later, there was indeed a global agreement, the Biological Weapons Convention, banning this type of weapon completely. But despite the optimism of the time, the treaty was deeply flawed. For a start, no one had defined what was meant by a biological weapon.
The prohibition, for example, in the Biological Weapons Convention does not say you can't have biological organisms that might be suitable for biological weapons, because you have legitimate purposes for those. You've got legitimate biotechnical industries for vaccines. You've got legitimate public health problems. You can't say to a country, you can't have anthrax, because you need a way to protect your animals and your population against naturally occurring anthrax. That's the same bug that becomes a biological weapon. So all you can say is you can't have them for offensive purposes. That means what you have to prohibit is intent. That's a very, very difficult discerning difference to make.
The inevitable result has been proliferation. The US claims 12 countries now have an offensive biological weapons capability. They won't say which, but information obtained by assignment suggests these are the most likely. But nearly all the rest have the industrial potential to produce germ weapons if they want to. It's a problem the international community preferred to ignore for nearly 2 decades. The Gulf War meant germ weapons were suddenly a very real threat. There was a chance that Iraq would actually use them.
I think the military got a real wake-up call about the potential of biological weapons with the Desert Storm operation in Iraq, when military planners considered that a small airplane flying across Saudi Arabia or a small speedboat cruising offshore could disseminate a cloud of deadly organisms that could induce massive casualties among the coalition forces. This is something that did worry a lot of military planners quite a bit during the campaign, and I think they still haven't really sorted out the consequences and the implications of that type of an attack.
Such was the Allies' fear of biological weapons that some of the very first air raids of the Gulf War were on Iraqi germ warfare sites. But little was known about them, and Allied concerns about the weapons remained intense, as Pentagon commanders revealed after the conflict.
The one that scares me to death, perhaps even more so than tactical nuclear weapons, and the one we have less capability against, biological weapons. And this was my greatest concern during Operation Desert Storm, knowing that the Iraqis had been working on such a capability. And so we have done...
it shook everybody up because documents that we had prepared for our side in that war, that were classified secret at the time until after the war was over, showed that we were vulnerable, not only to chemical weapons, but for biological weapons. It made it very clear to us that we thought we were fairly strong on chemical weapons, but we were still vulnerable. But on biological weapons, we were, I don't want to use the word completely vulnerable, but we didn't even have a device that could detect biological weapons.
The US Army is now trying to fill that gap. This tiny mobile laboratory, filmed here for the first time, is a new attempt to develop a detection system. The soldiers, in the safety of their airtight jeep, gather samples and run them through a series of tests in a hunt for biological weapons.
Outside temperature is 73.1 degrees. Wind direction is at 70 degrees. Liquid sampler's doing good. It's running all right. Romeo
The technology may be advanced, but the results so far are relatively crude.
Inside temperature is at 60 degrees and holding.
Press save sample button?
Yeah, go ahead and press now. Okay, record time. The reader substrate running kind of slow here.
But this is just a prototype, only able to detect a handful of well-known agents. The real need is for equipment that can detect any biological weapon. This is America's most sophisticated biological defense testing center. Yet even here, scientists admit their best detectors could be fooled by genetic engineering.
If we have a soldier in the field, we have to identify a bacteria that might present a threat. One of the principal ways to do it is to key in on how that bacteria looks, the surface of that bacteria. If one modifies the appearance of the bacteria, then our detection system, it may become invisible to our detection system. There are several different mechanisms that are available in theory to modify how a bacteria looks to the detector. One of them is through recombinant DNA, to modify the surface of the bacteria. So yes, the technology is in place. The theory is there where I could relatively rapidly convert how a bacteria looks.
Research into new detectors is underway, but the challenge is formidable. Simulated biological weapons are released. Sensors are meant to spot them and correctly analyze what they are. But the scientists know that the advantage in biological warfare currently lies with the attacker. None of the research going on here in this remote desert would be needed if the Biological Weapons Convention was doing its job properly. And because it isn't, the development of these detectors is an essential fallback. But a number of countries, including Britain, want to take this a stage further to tackle the root of the problem, which is the spread of biological weapons in the first place. Their plan is to toughen up the convention so that it can catch countries which are cheating.
In general, it hasn't worked. We have no way of knowing, and therefore the treaty is a gentleman's agreement, basically. As the technology that makes biological weapons easier to produce and use grows, something needs to be done to to give us a handle on whether countries are in fact complying. We need to have some facts, and there's only one way to find out. You've got to send people on site and have them take a look at sites that might be questionable.
But what is a questionable site? This huge fermenter is making 150 litres of botulinum toxin. Yet it isn't part of a military operation. It's in one of Britain's leading public health laboratories, and its purpose is medical. The organism is needed to produce vaccines. Yet, in theory, its use could easily be changed, and only close inspection can tell the difference.
An on-site inspection gives you the opportunity to talk to the staff concerned, to look at the documentation about the work that they're carrying out, and to carry out sampling, to see whether what they're doing is compliant with the convention. That is why a verification protocol absolutely needs to have on-site inspection. It is the one way in which you have a very real chance of detecting if a state is not compliant, and it will also cause a state to very much think twice before it goes down that road of trying to acquire biological weapons. It will judge that it may well be found out by an intrusive on-site verification.
This is a class 3 cabinet.
That's right, yes, it is.
So I presume that the inactivation step hasn't been carried out at this stage?
No, not at this stage. This is the inactivation step is carried out in an adjacent room.
Can you tell us how you inactivate the product?
Yes, you can.
This is a trial run of the kind of inspection Britain is pushing for. It may seem a reasonable plan, but it's facing criticism.
In order to have an intrusive inspection work, you have to have some kind of idea about where to go, where to look. Otherwise, you'll be looking in every nook and cranny throughout the country, and that's simply not possible. Let's take the case of Iraq as an example. We sent teams into Iraq and asked them to find out whether or not Iraq was manufacturing biological agents. And if you ask inspectors, as I did, whether or not the Iraqis could still be hiding quantities of agent or even a laboratory somewhere still manufacturing agent, they will answer yes, it is totally possible that this country, which is virtually occupied by UN inspectors, they can go anywhere, anytime, any place, and look anywhere they wish. But they have been unable to ascertain for sure that the Iraqis are not still making biological weapons or still storing them. It's just not possible.
Assignment obtained these first pictures from inside Al-Hakam, one of Iraq's main biotechnology centers. Officially, it makes animal vaccines, but UN sources say it was built for germ weapons and could still make them. And this is just one of many suspect sites in Iraq, as Saddam Hussein rebuilds his military power.
We are having to go to greater lengths to deal with biological weapons than in the other areas. For example, in the biological area, we know that they've been able to cannibalize equipment from different sites and to reassemble it with new stuff that they produce themselves into an operating production center.
The UN's inspections may never keep Iraq from regenerating its germ weapons program. And the idea of using similar inspections to enforce the Biological Weapons Convention faces opposition from a number of influential lobbies. A promotional video for the US biotechnology industry.
Restoring the body's natural balance by providing missing proteins that keep it healthy is one way that biotechnology is changing human health care. But how are these scarce natural proteins produced in the laboratory? New biological techniques have enabled scientists to discover...
Biotechnology is one of the fastest growing sectors of the American economy, and its powerful corporations mean to keep it that way. Profits are huge, but competition is intense, and secrecy has become a way of life. The industry depends on guarding the details of its biological processes.
This process is called genetic engineering, a tool of biotechnology.
The pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, here in Connecticut, is one firm which invests millions of dollars in each new genetically engineered product. We approached them for their view on inspections, but they declined to comment. However, it's believed their concern about inspections is not that weapons will be found, but that commercial secrets will be lost.
The major concern, if we go to a very intrusive inspection regime, would be the loss of proprietary information. A good example would be hepatitis B vaccine, which is used worldwide right now. The vaccine itself is produced in yeast, similar type of yeast that is used to bake bread or brew beer or make wine. This yeast strain has a unique property. It can produce the protein material needed to immunize people for hepatitis B. If I were an inspector and went into a hepatitis B vaccine facility and took a sample now from that facility, I would have in that small sample of yeast all of the information needed to produce a hepatitis B vaccine.
The American government also worries that the country's lead in bioengineering and the profits and jobs that go with that could be lost if inspections as part of the convention become too intrusive.
Despite the very honorable nature of most international civil servants, I would be very surprised if we did not have the potential for industrial espionage piggybacking on the back of an international inspection regime, and I certainly would be unprepared not to make preparations for it in terms of trying to safeguard against it.
So far, we've been talking about restoring the body's balance, its health, by using biotechnology to diagnose disease or to produce the body's own proteins for treatment. But the potential of biotechnology...
And we should also consider the fact that biotechnology is not just limited to this country. There's certainly vibrant biotechnology efforts underway in many of the other nation states that are parties to the convention. And I would suspect that the industry in those countries will be equally concerned about verification and inspection protocols.
India is one of those countries with just such a concern. Its biotech industry is essential for the development of its agriculture and healthcare. It resents what it sees as the colonial nature of international inspections. India also claims that Western powers want to use the Biological Weapons Convention to spy on its armed forces.
The real problem we are facing is what the West are now pushing for, and which I think is a very devious act which they're indulging in. And it's for what's called off-site inspection. Off-site inspection means inspection via aerial and satellite survey. Now, we are reasonably convinced that there is no way by an aerial or satellite survey you can find out a biological weapon is being manufactured in some little lab somewhere. We believe that this is a very intrusive method that is being adopted, not from the point of view of biological weapons, but more from the point of view of trying to ensure India adopts, or third world countries accept, the open sky thought by which they can really know every single defense establishment.
Other developing nations claim their concerns in this debate have also been forgotten. They point out that the Biological Weapons Convention wasn't only meant to ban germ weapons, it was also supposed to offer better access to civil technology in exchange.
The treaty includes a provision calling for technological cooperation among the parties, in particular in matters of public health and other areas of peaceful use of biotechnology. This provision has never been implemented, and yet many of the parties to the treaty see it as a central part of the treaty and come to the review conferences, for example, in the hope that finally something will be done to implement that provision. Too often the developed countries have nothing but scorn for this because they feel this is an arms control treaty and security is its own reward. I think that this is not seeing things in true perspective. I think that many developing countries really have more important issues on their minds. And I think that if the treaty is in the long run to be effective, it has to address some of these issues in relation to biotechnology. There has to be a feeling that there is access to biotechnology to all countries in the world if they're all going to be willing to open up and make sure that their activities are okayed by the international community and be subject to inspections.
This argument surfaced in Geneva, where, since the autumn, the convention's been under review. Britain is trying to give the treaty new teeth, but developing nations want the promised access to technology.
While we want to agree on a verification mechanism in the convention, we should be ensured that Article 10, that is concerning the promotion of access to technology between the countries in the convention, should be promoted and should be implemented.
What will your position be if the West does not give you this greater access to technology?
I think then we will be in a difficult position to agree with a strengthened verification mechanism in the convention, because we will feel that there is no benefit for the developing countries to accept an intrusive verification mechanism in the treaty.
Japan, as well, has been objecting to too intrusive a system of inspections. Its delegation even included 2 representatives of Japanese industry. Other countries were conspicuous by their absence.
Among its various new components, the verification has undoubtedly been considered as the highest priority, and it has become a kind of watchword for the disarmament negotiations of the 80s, 90s, and beyond.
The American position became clear as well. Toughening up the treaty isn't worth the potential damage to industry.
Our industry believes, and I think we agree in the U.S. government, a leading biotechnical industry in the world. We don't believe that we can get the United States to ratify, the United States Congress, for a very good reason. A regime which would seriously threaten and undermine that kind of industrial activity in the biotechnical industry. And the reason for that is that in such a regime, we still don't believe that we can come up with an absolute plus or minus answer that will be infallible in terms of taking care of all the potential cheaters in the world. And so the risk simply is not worth the potential gain.
These talks are set to last for another 2 years and may, at the end of that, add some modest powers to the convention. But it looks at this stage unlikely that the plans for highly intrusive inspections will get through. And even if they do, that won't be an end of the problem, because these negotiations are between governments and take no account of what individuals or groups of people may do with biological weapons. It's no secret that because the weapons are so cheap and devastating, they'd be ideal for terrorism. Yet that threat isn't even on the agenda here.
The reason that biological weapons are so useful to a terrorist and so usable by a terrorist are primarily because they're easy to manufacture and cheap. I myself feel that I could manufacture a biological agent in my home if I were dedicated to doing so. I could also transport it through airport systems undetected and could deliver it to any country I wish to travel to. I really think I could do that, and given that case, that means that terrorists could too.
White House security experts have examined just such a scenario. A small ship sailing off Manhattan up the Hudson River disperses anthrax spores using an industrial paint sprayer. Within 48 hours, over 400,000 people will die. Long before then, the boat will have been scuttled, the terrorists will have escaped.
Right now, the threat of a biological attack from either a country or from a terrorist is very great against Western governments or against any government or society on Earth. And the fact that they can be delivered without really knowing who it was that delivered it makes it all the more dangerous. We simply are not prepared to deal with a massive attack against population or, mind you, against crops or food animals or any living thing.
I would like to think that the use of biological weapons will not happen in this century. The trend lines indicate, though, that it is more likely today than ever before that an adversary might use biological weapons, and not necessarily as a weapon of last resort, but integrated into a full battle. And the tragedy would be if we're not prepared for that contingency.
This might be such a contingency. This time, it's just a simulated biological attack. The task of scientists at Dugway Proving Ground is to detect it from up to 15 kilometers away.
And the aircraft is at 35K. Are we running a 10 or 15 run today? 15K.
It's a mission which is pushing at the limits of science.
Bearcat 7 Zephyr 4, any hits, over.
Bearcat 7, Roger, sir, but we did on master.
Assignment obtained exclusive access to the first flight test of the world's only long-range biological detector. Through the open door of a Black Hawk helicopter, an advanced laser scans the horizon. "15 kilometers away, the laser beam penetrates the cloud and reflects off individual molecules inside the bacteria. Single photons of reflected light are detected back on the Black Hawk and analyzed. A computer display reveals the extent of the attack. The technology looks impressive, but has its critics.
When people talk about defending against biological weapons, they're talking about defending troops. They're not talking about defending the public. They're not talking about defending us. And yet, biological weapons are more suited for use against large populations, knocking a city out, sort of thing. So defenses are not the answer in my book.
This is the very best there is in biological defense, yet all it can do is detect that biological weapons have been used. It can't do anything about destroying them. And anyway, the system is only meant to help protect troops, not civilians. So most of us remain vulnerable to microorganisms which may be genetically engineered and previously unheard of, which the treaty has failed to stop, and for which there may be no cure.
The trouble with a biological weapon is that it is one of those areas of a weapon of mass destruction in which we're trying very hard to keep it in the bottle as much as we can, so to speak, because once it gets out and you get across that threshold, it's going to be almost impossible to put the biological weapons problem back into that bottle.
50 years ago, the nuclear genie was unleashed and cannot be stopped. Now, the genie of germ warfare is on the loose, and no one can predict the consequences.